If you've read my latest book, you will understand that my mother and my relationship growing up was a bit on the contentious side. One might even say conflicted. It has been my tendency over the years to blame her, but I must be honest and recognize my own contributions to that conflicted relationship. I am one who pushes the boundaries. Okay, what boundaries? They don't apply to me, do they? I questioned everything. I pushed back at rules and regulations, attempts to coerce my behavior. Yeah, I probably pushed her to the point of exasperation, and her only recourse was the hickory switch. And she was good at that. But that all changed when I turned 13 and my father died. Our relationship was reformed. It changed. No longer was it as much parent child as a friendship. Well, there was nothing weird about it, it just was different. We did things differently. We did work around the house together. She taught me how to drive. I taught her how to organize. There were late night studies as she went back to college and I helped her through a nursing degree. We read books together, shared what we learned in school together. We shared a loaf of bread and a beer on occasion. And we did crazy things, like deciding one night at midnight that, well, since we were both awake and had nothing else to do, we'd wallpaper the living room. It was a wild and wonderful time. It was probably the best 5, 6 years of our relationship together in her 94 years. It was sad that it too would come to an end. But for those days, it was a glorious time. We see such a reforming of relationships in the Bible all the time. The relationship between God and God's creation is off to a pretty good start in Genesis, but goes south pretty quickly as humanity shows its true colors, that it wants to be in control, despite what God says about our best interest. And then it becomes a matter of control. Throughout the pages of Genesis and into Exodus, who's in charge? Is it God or is it us? And despite our best efforts to screw it up, God continues to bless his people. And yet we end up complaining and rebelling again and again and again. And so we find in Exodus that God gives us some guidance, the Torah, the law, that we might live healthy in relationship to one another and to God. But yeah, like anything else, we don't like it because it's not in our control. And so we continue to rebel and push back and ignore. And the consequences are pretty harsh. But despite it, we keep doing it. And God recognizes that there is no punishment that will seem to control us, change us. We are who we are. And so God does a really bizarre thing. He reforms the relationship. The prophet Jeremiah points to it early on, that the days are coming when God will make a new covenant, a new relationship. Not like the old one that we kept breaking, though we were in relationship with God. This will be a new one, different. And oh, it was. For God comes down in human form in Jesus the Christ and establishes a new relationship. Not one based on the law, on the rights and the wrongs. Do this and I'll love you, or don't do this and I'll kick your butt. But rather, you are mine. And there is nothing you can do to screw this relationship up, because it's not about you. It's about me, says God. And he seals that when he dies on the cross, that we might know in those outstretched arms how much God truly does love us and care for us. St. Paul captures that whole notion of God's loving grace in a simple phrase called justification by grace through faith. That we are made right with God, not by our own actions, but by God's grace, by God's love for us again and again, despite ourselves, because we continue to screw it up. But God continues to come to us to give us grace and love. In the midst of the consequences of our actions, God picks us up, dusts us off, and walks with us. It is that sense of God's grace that becomes the basis for that crazy Lutheran Martin. In 16th century, he recaptures that sense of God's grace, because we, including the church, have a tendency to revert to our old selves and our old ways, and we got really heavy in the law. Do this and and God will love you. Don't do this and God will send you to hell. And Luther reminds the church, the world, of God's grace. And the church has never been the same since. We continue to struggle 500 years later, because we still want it our way. And so we become a church of do's and don'ts, of correct beliefs and not correct beliefs, of some being saved and some going to hell, as though somehow we're in control. But the reality is, this is still God's creation. And God has promised that we are made right with God, not by us, but by God. And God sends us out into the world to live in that sense of relationship, not only with God, but with one another, to practice grace and love for our brothers and sisters. Jesus came not to condemn the world, but to save it. And in him, God has done precisely that we may continue to live in that relationship with God and with one another, now and forever.